These days, AI seems to be taking on the world by storm in the creative industry, and we've seen the latest AI autofocus updates in Sony cameras like the A7R5, which I had a blast testing, and now in a smaller, more compact body, the A6700. Hey, how's it going guys? Welcome back to another review with me, Ryan, and today we are taking a look at the Sony A6700. I've used this camera now for about a week and I took it out to shoot some client projects, doing some interviews, doing some B-rolls, and straight out of the box when I got the camera, I was super impressed. I went into the menu system to check what this camera can do in terms of recording, and this camera can shoot 4K 100 frames and it can do S-Log 3. Also, the AI autofocus is so good. I was quite surprised, honestly, because a camera of this caliber in the past, you wouldn't expect it to be able to do similar capabilities such as the Sony Cinema line like the FX3 or FX6, but to have it in such a small body, I was super impressed. But we do have to take note though, even though it can do all these capabilities, this camera is still an APS-C camera, so you're going to be expecting a crop factor when you're shooting on this camera. In terms of design, you're going to be expecting very similar design factors as compared to all the other A6000 series. So you're expecting like a boxy design, and the viewfinder, electronic viewfinder, is at the corner of the camera. So unlike traditional Sony Alpha cameras where the electronic viewfinder is at the top, I do find this very handy because packing it into bags and stuff like that, it doesn't really pop out, so that's a plus for me. And the other difference as compared to the A6600 is that now you get a vari-angle LCD screen, which I think is a must in every camera, because nowadays when you're shooting, like the previous versions of Sony cameras where it just kind of tilts out, it's not exactly the best, because if you're using like a gimbal and stuff like that, it's so much more flexible to have a screen where you can just flip around, and it also works if you want to vlog with this camera. In terms of the buttons and ports, very similar to the other predecessors of the A6000 series, but you do get a dial where you can switch between the photo, video, as well, and S and Q. So that's really handy. But yeah, I feel like everything, the button layout is quite similar. And in terms of the ports, you do get a single SD card slot, and obviously you have your microphone jack as well as your headphone jack, and you do get a USB-C jack as well, so you can use an external power bank to power this camera if you run out of battery on this camera. Micro HDMI as well on the side. And in terms of camera, same as all the other Sony Alpha series cameras, we are using for this camera an NP-FZ100. So if you already own a A6600, upgrading to this camera is not a big issue. I'm not sure if Sony has changed anything in terms of the internal body design, but I did realize when shooting on this camera at 4K 50 out in the Singapore heat, and as you guys know, if you're living in Singapore, we are kind of experiencing a heat wave now and it's super hot outside. But testing this out, shooting B-roll out in the park and stuff like that, I never had any issues of overheating at all. And in terms of the body weight, I would expect it to, if it has a fan inside, I'll expect it to be heavier. But it weighs 493 grams, which is 10 grams lighter than the A6600. Do take note though, the body is slightly beefier in terms of the bulge as compared to the A6600. And as I previously mentioned, this camera is a APS-C sensor, so you're not going to get that full frame goodness such like the FX3 or the A7S3, but it does have a Bion ZXR image processing unit, which Sony claims is 8 times more efficient than the A6600. Other than that, it can shoot stills at 26 megapixels, so honestly I feel like this camera is a very well-rounded camera. Alright, let's talk functions. So in terms of functions, this camera does plenty, but let's talk about the AI processing unit first and what it does in terms of the autofocus. So the camera does have a similar AI processing unit such as the A7R5, and for those of you that haven't watched my A7R5 review, let me just refresh what the AI processing unit does in terms of the autofocus. So in traditional cameras, when you're shooting a talent or a human body, I would say like in the more recent Sony cameras, they would recognize the head of the talent or even focus on the eye. But in instances when the talent is facing around or just like moving around, and when the eye or the head isn't in shot, the camera would then shift the focus a bit. And obviously if you're shooting video, you wouldn't want that. But with the AI processing unit, the camera not only recognizes the face or the eye of the talent that you're shooting, but it also recognizes the body and the movement when you're shooting. So how does this help you in your video shooting process? If you have someone that's walking around behind an item like foliage or whatnot, the camera wouldn't like shift around the focus. It would understand that, okay, the head is not in shot, let me focus on the body instead. So with that, I would say that the autofocusing is so much more precise and so much more accurate on the A6700. And other than just autofocusing, this camera can shoot up to 11 frames per second in terms of photography stills, and it can shoot at more than 1000 shots at one go, which is honestly super impressive. But I feel like one of the more interesting factors about the A6700 is that when you're shooting 4K, it is an oversampled 6K footage, much like the FX3 which I am shooting on right now. So interestingly, I brought this camera out to do my client shoots and interviews, and I needed like a 2-cam setup. So I brought my A6700 as well as the FX3 shooting the same shot, and comparing the shots side by side, taking note that the A6700 is a APS-C camera. Looking at both of the footage, honestly, I couldn't really tell much of a difference on the camera screen, and the footage that I get out of the A6700 is super clean and super sharp, which I was really impressed with. The camera also boasts a 14 stops of dynamic range when you're shooting in S-Log3, which I have to say is really nice. Oh, also, it shoots in 10-bit, which I love, because for me, as some of you guys already know in my reviews, I don't really like to shoot like Rec 709 out of my camera. I prefer to shoot flat and then bringing it into my DaVinci Resolve, for example, and do the color grading there. So when I brought the footage out of this camera and shooting it, I shot in 4K 50 S-Log3 10-bit, bringing it into Premiere Pro and just throwing a Rec 709 LUT on it, it was super clean. And I will go a little bit more into detail in terms of the dynamic range in the real world test. But other than that, the user interface is very similar to the ZV-1 Mark II, which I just reviewed a couple of days ago. And what I mean by that is that when you're shooting in the video mode, you have all these different functions at the side of the screen, which is very easily accessible, because previously when you are using the older Sony cameras, if you want to change some of these settings, you have to go into the menu and then you have to find the exact setting that you want to change, and it's just really fussy and it takes a lot of time, or at least I should say more time than what it is now if you're using the A6700, because everything is just right at your fingertips, literally. So I guess with the ZV-1 Mark II, I mentioned that it would make sense because for people that are using it to vlog, you know, if you have the screen just flip forward, it's very easy for you to just change like the camera settings, and you can even swipe up to go into more detail, changing like your ISO, your white balance and stuff like that. And just note that all of these functions are customizable within the menu system, so that is a plus for me. And honestly, yeah, I really do like this menu system that Sony has incorporated into the A6700, and I'm excited to see if they continue to do that in the upcoming Sony cameras as well. So to test this camera out, Sony did send me the 11mm f1.8, and look at how small and tiny this lens is. Obviously it is an APS-C lens, but I think they did a right choice in sending me this combination because it was so light. Shooting on a gimbal with this setup was so easy when I was just like moving around trying to get all those cinematic shots. It was super light, which I am totally not used to, but I am definitely grateful for. And as you guys know, I usually shoot on the FX3 with the 2470, and it's not even the Mark II, which is a lot lighter than Mark 1. So in terms of weight, it was very nice to use a lighter setup. And speaking of the FX3 as well as the A6700, I did do an interview setup where I needed 2 cams, and both the cameras were shooting at ISO 800 S-Log3, and all I really had to do to match those shots up was to just throw on a Rec 709 LUT. So as you guys can see in the interview footage right now, in terms of the clarity, honestly, I don't feel like I can see much of a difference. But obviously the A6700 is a APS-C sensor, so I would say that in terms of comparing it to the FX3 in low light, it's definitely not going to do as well as a full frame sensor like the FX3 or any of the other full frame cameras that Sony produces. So other than the B-roll I was shooting in the park or the interviews that I was doing, I did bring the camera to shoot a art workshop, just doing some event coverage. And in the art workshop, there was honestly a lot of people, but it was such a breeze using the Alpha 6700 because all I really had to do was just set the autofocus setting to human priority, and the AI processing unit did all the work for me. Throughout the shoot, I was just moving around a lot, just shooting whatever I can, really focusing on trying to get the shot, while the camera handled most of the autofocusing for me. So as you can see in the footage right now, there was really not much focus breathing. There wasn't like focus hunting at all, and safe to say the AI processing unit is really such a game changer for this camera, and I'm looking forward and I hope that all the other Sony cameras that are coming out in the future does have the same AI processing unit as the A6700. So the 14 stops of dynamic range wasn't just numbers too. In the shots where I brought the camera out to shoot park and the sea and stuff like that, when I brought it back into Premiere Pro and throwing on a Rec 709 LUT, I was honestly quite impressed because it was able to bring out all the details in the sky, and I could actually see the clouds, which I would say in my experience using other cameras out there when I'm trying to grade, it's very difficult to balance like the highlights and shadows. But straight out of the camera, I didn't even do much. Well, honestly, I didn't even do much color grading at all. The camera was able to just retain all the details in the shadows and highlights. So imagine what could be achieved if you actually brought it into DaVinci Resolve to do like professional color grading. The possibilities are honestly endless. So if you do have a Sony camera that can shoot S-Log3 in 10-bit, I do highly recommend you shooting in that format because you would then be able to retain so much more detail because you're shooting in a flat color profile. But obviously, if you're doing run and gun and you don't want to do too much like post-production, then shooting it in a regular Rec 709 would be best, but definitely try it out. Alright, so my summary and personal opinion, I do feel like this camera is a beast. It is really so impressive. It really did change my impression on APS-C cameras because back in the day, I started on an APS-C camera myself, and I used, I think, a Canon 70D, was it? I think so, but when I was transitioning to video, it was total trash. The camera, even shooting at like normal ISO, I could see the noise and everything, and it's really impressive to see how APS-C cameras have really grown over the years. And for Sony, I think this is a big win because of all the extra capabilities that they have put in it. And like I mentioned before, my biggest takeaway for this camera is honestly that it can shoot at 4K 100, 10-bit S-Log3, and also have an AI processing unit to do all the autofocusing for you, which is such a beast. So how much does this camera cost? Because from me beefing up this camera all the time, you might think it's gonna cost a lot, but honestly, I feel like for its price range, it's actually quite affordable. So for the body only, you're expecting to pay $2,049, and take note, this is Singapore dollars, and it also comes with two other options where you can choose if you want to buy it with the lens itself. So the first option is with the L kit, which is $2,219, which gives you the 16 to 50 mm. And if you want to have like longer extended range, you can pay $2,599. And that is the M kit, which gives you a 16 to 135 mm lens. So pre-order starts on 15 July. So definitely, if you can, test it out before you pre-order because I highly recommend it. But also there's a lot of free goodies that you can check out on the Sony website. So who would I recommend it for? If you're looking for a camera that doesn't exactly break your bank, I would say check out the A6700 for all its capabilities. I didn't exactly get to test the photo capabilities of this camera, but being that it's a 26 megapixel camera, honestly, I feel like it's better than a lot of cameras out there, and it's good enough if you want to do professional work. And yeah, for videos, 100%, hands down. I've used it for professional work, so I can give you the security that this definitely does work in a professional setting and it doesn't overheat, which is, I feel like, something Sony has been battling for a really long time, and I'm glad to see that a camera like this can even stand the heat out in the Singapore weather. So if you're looking for a camera that you can travel with, do professional work with, small and compact, definitely the A6700. I had an absolute blast reviewing this camera, and as always, whenever Sony sends me a camera that I can use for my professional work, it is 100% A+, and it's safe to say that the A6700 has my stamp of approval. So as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this Ryan Mamba's perspective, and also I do want to mention, Me talking about this camera and all of its capabilities that you can get out of this small body, you would think that Sony is paying me to do this review, but no, nobody's paying me. Sony's not sponsoring me to say all this good stuff. It really is a super nice camera. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Ryan Mamba's perspective, and I'll see you guys in the next one.